This is episode 8 of the Wiener Dog Lover podcast with our guest, Terrie Hayward. Do you have a dachshund and have questions on topics like training and nutrition? Do you want a dachshund and need help locating a breeder or finding a great rescue? Did you have a dachshund growing up and want to share some funny or heartwarming stories? Then you're in the right place. Welcome to the Wiener Dog Lover podcast, the place to be for all things dachshund. Welcome back, Wiener Dog Lovers. I hope wherever you are listening from, you're still enjoying some summer-like weather. I'm in Calgary, Alberta, and we've already had one light snowfall, and that means baby Wiener is hiding in the mornings, and as he is not a fan of the cold, I'm sure many of you can relate. Baby Wiener is a smooth dachshund, and he does not like to be outside in the cold, so his favorite place is to sit on the heat rad, on the radiator, or the heating vent, and that's where he's been pretty much for the last week and a half. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode with our IVDD success story and our highlight of All-American Dachshund Rescue. If you have an IVDD success story or a rescue that you'd like me to highlight, I'd hope that you would send me an email with that in the subject line and maybe we can talk to them. Today's episode, we cover the topic of separation anxiety. Terrie Hayward is a trainer that specializes in working with separation anxiety, and during our conversation, we discuss what separation anxiety really is and how it's often mistreated. I really enjoyed this interview, and I think that there's a lot of information, and you may want to listen to this a couple of times to get all of the really valuable information that Terrie shares with us. So let's get into it. Hello, Terrie. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. I've introduced you to everyone, so maybe now you could just introduce your current pack and what set you on the path to working with both deaf dogs and dogs with separation anxiety.
Sure. Okay, so I'll try to do that in a nutshell. My background is education. I have a master's in bilingual special education, and I was also running a rescue group. So working with animals was my passion for since I was young. And I attended a conference at Veterans Animal Society in Utah, and the light bulb moment sort of went off. Education, animals, I could combine that and be a trainer. Prior to that, I hadn't really considered that as a career path. And so from there, I just started diving into everything that I could find about learning more with regard to how to work with animals appropriately and to build my skill set and credentialed background so that I could turn this into a full-time business. And later on, we adopted a dog. Well, we were fostering the dog. She became a foster, quote, failure, and she was deaf. And I couldn't find a lot of resources that I liked that were positive reinforcement based and based in data versus sort of myths. And so that led me to writing the book, A Deaf Dog Joins the Family, and focusing more on working with animals with hearing issues. And again, with my background in special education, I think that sort of dovetailed nicely. And finally, separation anxiety. I was on Facebook late one night, and I noted Melina DiMartini Price was on there, and she was really busy. And I had sent her a message and asked if she might be looking to do some mentoring, because I was really interested in separation anxiety and working remotely, which is how we do that. And she suggested that she was just about to start a beta test for her new course, and so I was one of the first people to go through the course, and now I'm a staff member with her, and I take separation anxiety cases on my own, but I also take them through referrals from her. So, yeah, that's sort of where I am today, and now I work, as you mentioned, with dogs with separation anxiety, dogs who have issues with hearing or other special needs. And I also focus a lot on husbandry and stress-free or lower stress, reducing fear, anxiety, and stress in dogs with everyday grooming and, again, husbandry skills and behaviors.
That's very interesting, Terrie. We both have a little bit in common. I have had a blind deaf dog and I was a groomer, or I am a groomer. Now, we all know that it's common knowledge that as a Wiener Dog lover, dachshunds can be a little bit barky and also not a real big fan of being left alone. How do we determine if what we're dealing with is separation anxiety?
Yeah, I wrote an article which I can share with you afterwards. It was actually for Deaf Dogs Rock, so obviously geared towards deaf dogs, but the same is true for hearing dogs, obviously for dachshunds as well. And specifically, it talks about determining first the cause of the barking. You know, are we looking at a dog that's bored? Are we looking at a dog that's barking for attention? Or is there a medical reason? Are they in pain? Or maybe is it resulting from anxiety? So once we determine the reason for the barking, then we can decide upon our approach to help the dog to feel more relaxed and reduce that barking.
Are there tests that we can do to determine whether it's separation anxiety, or how do we just determine what exactly it is that they're barking at?
A lot of times, enlisting the help of a positive reinforcement trainer who's really skilled at reading dog body language will help you out. And so the first step would be to rule out anything medical, which would mean that you'd want to take your dog to the vet to make sure that there isn't any pain or underlying other type of a cause that might be causing the barking. Then again, you'd want to have someone observe, again, a professional ideally, what's going on, because oftentimes people are unaware that they're inadvertently reinforcing barking, which would be, for example, the attention-seeking behavior. With regard to the anxiety side of things, and specifically separation anxiety and the big umbrella that covers, a lot of times we'll ask folks a number of questions. For example, is the dog only barking when they're alone or don't have access to you? Because alone could also mean in the house, but a baby gate is up and you've walked upstairs and they can't get to where you are. And also, have you watched remotely or taped what's going on when you're not present? And then we'll get a look at that. And frequently, barking that goes on for more than a few minutes, oftentimes combined with some other stressors, may determine that we're looking at separation anxiety.
What common behaviors are often misdiagnosed as separation anxiety?
I think it's oftentimes the other way around, where we'll have dogs maybe that have come through rescue, or that people have, you'll see them sort of complaining on a forum about dogs who are, again, barking incessantly, or to the point where their neighbors are upset. That's oftentimes how people find out that the dog has been home alone and very anxious. Or they're eliminating in the house and they otherwise have been completely house trained. So it's only occurring, again, when they're by themselves. Or there's some kind of destruction going on. And that destruction could be, tearing up books or getting clothes, or, it doesn't necessarily need to be the more severe version, which of course we see too, which is where they've, chewed through a wall or all around a door frame kind of thing.
Do we see self-mutilation sometimes in separation anxiety?
Yeah, oftentimes we might see that if a dog is confined to a crate.
Okay. And
I'm pro-crate. I think that crates can be a very useful tool, especially when trained positively. When dogs need to go, for example, to the groomers, also oftentimes they might need to be in a crate for a period of time. So I think it's really helpful if we've trained a dog to feel comfortable and voluntarily enter a crate. The one unique exception is often with a dog who's suffering from separation anxiety or isolation distress, because in that situation, frequently we see dogs who also have confinement issues. So often if the dog is being destructive, the answer that well-intentioned folks will maybe have given and people will follow up with is get a crate. So then we've, quote, stopped the destruction unless they're destroying right through the crate and breaking out, which sometimes happens. But we haven't addressed the real problem, which is the anxiety. And if we get rid of the anxiety, then we get rid of the destructive behavior versus just putting the dog in a crate, which now maybe has exacerbated the stress.
That's great. I also do believe in crating, and it's interesting to know that sometimes, though, it can cause stress or more anxiety to a dog that has separation anxiety. Are there different stages of separation anxiety? I know I work with dogs that come in to our foster care through Alberta Dachshund Rescue, and it's interesting to know whether there's some stages that are easier to work with or cases, I guess, more so than stages.
I think, there are three categories: mild, moderate, and severe, but that does not necessarily impact the speed of a resolution. More importantly would be how long the behavior has been continuing without having been addressed. If we have a family that, let's say, summer is over and during the summer everybody's sort of been home with the dog, and all of a sudden people go back to work and back to school, and 1 or 2 weeks in they notice there's something significant happening and they seek professional help right away. We've only got a couple weeks worth of repeating that behavior versus if we have someone who says, my dog has been suffering like this for 5 years. Just like any behavior modification, the longer that the dog has practiced the unwanted behavior, the longer it may take to seek a resolution.
That's so true. Dogs that I see that in the grooming process, that dogs that haven't had anybody working with them, they've had this habit for a long time. It takes a lot longer to bring them around into being able to accept the grooming process. So I can imagine it would be the same thing with a behavior in terms of separation anxiety, that it would take a little while to bring it around. So where do you suggest that a pet owner start? Do they start at their veterinarian? Do you suggest a medication of some sort? What are the first steps that someone should look at taking?
So it's always a good idea as a first step to rule out anything medical. So vet check to make sure that there's nothing else going on. And one of the questions I do ask during an intake is whether or not they've discussed the behavior with their vet and what the response has been. Because, of course, we would want to have the veterinarian on our team as well as we're moving forward so that there's transparency. Some vets, too, may be reluctant to prescribe medication without having seen some efforts in the behavior modification realm first. And usually my experience has been that to see some success with medication, it's usually a combination of medication with behavior modification that gets us to the resolution we're seeking. And with medication, too, we're not looking to change the dog's personality or sort of drug them up or sedate them per se, but we're just looking for the type of medication that's oftentimes long-term, ongoing, at least while working through the problem, versus an episodic med that allows us to sort of just let that dog take the edge off enough to then move through the protocols. Because if they're so stressed that they can't even work towards the solution, then it's hard to gain some traction. So working with the vet is a key component. And I think, too, that having the expectation, having that conversation with the vet early is key because just like with humans, sometimes it requires a medication dosage change or a medication change, and these types of meds are not instantaneous, so it might take a little while to get into the dog system before you know that you need to make an adjustment too with your vet. So that conversation, like I mentioned early, is an important piece of the protocol.
That's a very interesting point, that just because they take the medication doesn't mean it happens right away, and that they'll have to possibly play around with the medication to get it right. So it's going to be kind of a dance between you and the clients and their vet to work everything else out and get it all balanced out. I guess now where we start is, how does one go about getting a diagnosis that is separation anxiety? Where does that diagnosis come from?
So separation anxiety is diagnosed by a vet. It's a medical condition, a panic disorder. However, for example, I have worked with dogs who have not officially been diagnosed by their vet with separation anxiety, but working with enough cases where the behavior is present and evident, we can move down the path following a protocol to work with a dog who either suffers from separation anxiety or isolation distress. And to make that distinction, separation anxiety is sort of a big umbrella term that, as you know, everybody utilizes, but isolation distress is really more common because separation anxiety is when a dog can only be comfortable with one or sometimes two humans, which makes the management side of things really difficult. But with isolation distress, as long as there's a warm body present, a human present, they tend to be okay, which for covering absences makes it a lot easier.
I do see that as well in the grooming salon, in that it doesn't really matter if it's the owner or somebody else as long as it's a warm body. I've had also clients that will say that their dog was fine, and then as he got older, things developed and changed over time. So is separation anxiety something that can change and or develop, I guess, over time or develop later in life?
Yeah, there's currently no definitive cause for separation anxiety, but oftentimes it's prompted by an environmental change. There can be some factors which may predispose a dog to later developing separation anxiety, like being a singleton puppy, early air travel, in a crated situation. There are a variety of things which might be sort of upsetting and anxiety producing early on, but certainly any kind of a change, like a move or a child goes back to college, or the primary human in the house was working from home because they broke their leg and then they went back to work outside of the home. Or I had someone who redecorated and they had curtains on the window, but then they had shutters, and the shutters made noise with the wind in a way the curtains didn't. Any kind of a permutation of something new might spark a dog who probably was a little bit anxious to begin with, if we were to look back, to then display the behaviors associated with separation anxiety.
Interesting. So if we have a dog that is fine with their owner, so they have no anxiety issues at home, but then they go to, for example, a pet sitter, and they are in a group with a number of different dogs, and they have anxiety there where they bust out of a kennel or they can't be left alone, would that be considered just anxiety, or would it be considered separation anxiety?
Well, I would say that would probably be anxiety. I mean, in that situation, my first go-to would be, there are multiple animals. The dog might not be comfortable in that setting, et cetera, et cetera. However, it certainly can be context-based. I've had folks who, for example, one woman, her dog was definitely suffering in her home. However, she could take her dog to her mom's house, and she could leave, and then her mom could leave, leaving the dog at home at her mom's house, and the dog was okay there. So, it depends. However, oftentimes people are using the combination of doggy daycares and pet sitters to suspend absences while working on the problem. And oftentimes they'll have to talk to the folks at the doggy daycare because that dog still may not be comfortable being kenneled or crated or in a space without a human presence, even in the daycare scenario. Just like at home. So we would want to watch out for that with whoever is helping to cover those absences when the primary caregiver can't be present.
We do know that, like anything else, each dog is an individual case, but is there some standard protocols that you start to follow when you have a dog that's got a diagnosis of separation anxiety? Where would they start? What would be the beginning process or the beginning protocols for working with a dog with separation anxiety?
Yeah, I do a 30-minute complimentary consult. So if someone suspects that their dog has separation anxiety, the first step would be I would direct them to my website where they can send me an email. It's a little brief form that gives me a little bit of background. And then we can schedule that call where I'll talk them through exactly how it would work. I'll ask them a few more questions because occasionally we discern that it really is just a confinement issue problem. If they leave the dog not crated, the dog is okay. Or sometimes it's not separation anxiety. Unfortunately, more often than not it is. But occasionally we get a dog that's suffering from just something else, just some training needs. So the next step is that if they choose to move forward, I work via a platform called Zoom, which is similar to Skype, and we set up our initial meeting. We do a rehearsal of a departure so that I can determine the starting point. And over time, working with the clients, we're going to help them to really brush up on their skills with regard to body language to determine relaxation versus stress and to really pinpoint whether or not we're ready to push the criteria, stick where we are, or drop it back. As you mentioned earlier, it's a little bit of a dance, day to day, step to step. And then I would share with them my desktop because we would work daily on a set of exercises, which we called missions because it sounds less aversive to the humans than saying homework. And and so I would show them sort of what the template of those missions will look like, and they'll provide feedback each day so that we can, again, determine what we're doing with the criteria as we move forward. And as you mentioned with regard to outside help, because step one, I should have just interjected back then, is suspending absences. Just like if we're working with a dog who's, let's say, terrified of children, we're not going to have them around kids while we're working on that fear because that would be flooding. So with dogs who are terrified of being alone, we're going to suspend absences while working on the problem, while gradually building the duration of the amount of time that they're comfortable alone. And so if we've got caregivers helping, whether it be a doggy daycare, pet sitter, friends, family. I also have a letter which I can furnish to a client, which explains, sort of backs them up as to why you can't leave the dog alone, what we would like for them in terms of helping out, etc.
I would imagine that you would get a bit of feedback, more so fear from your clients when you tell them that basically that their dog can't be left alone. And especially if you're dealing with somebody with a young dog, they would be looking at thinking in their minds that for the next 15 years their dog can never be left alone. How do you get them past that?
Yeah, well, two things. First, hopefully, by working on the problem, eventually we will build to a duration whereby they can leave the dog alone, which is our goal. So they don't need to think of it as a lifelong sort of sentence, because again, our hope is that we will work on the problem so that the dog feels comfortable by themselves. Second, many times people who have gotten to the point where they're reaching out for help are already suspending absences because of what the dog is doing when they're alone. Either they're destroying the house or they're so upset that the neighbors are complaining and they're at risk of, losing their lease, or they're just extremely upset by watching their dog go through this level of stress. So many times people have not been leaving the dog alone. And those who have, once you explain to them the importance of it, I'll say to clients, you can lay out your schedule, we'll put it out in a big block, and then just look at the areas that you need coverage. Let's look at where you would need someone to help, while you're away at this time, and then figure out how to fill those coverage pieces in. And, the amount of compliance that we get from dogs and families, from families working with dogs with separation anxiety is astronomical. People really feel almost trapped in their home, and they're looking for a way for this animal to feel comfortable so that they are not in that situation, and neither is the dog, and they're willing to do the work to get there. So if suspending absences is part of what that work entails, they're on board.
That's a good point. I imagine that at this point they're already at the end of their leash, so any possibility of working with a dog and having some success would give them hope. So if starting with that is what they have to do, then that's what they have to do. What are some of the common misconceptions that people have on how they should deal with separation anxiety? I know we did discuss the crating issue, but what other things might be some misconceptions out there that people are doing that maybe are not beneficial for the dog?
In terms of myths, things like food puzzles, and again, I think food puzzles are great. So Kongs, slow feeders, etc. They're fabulous, except with a dog that has separation anxiety, because often what we find in that situation is the dog will eat the Kong, and then after 15 minutes, the symptoms reappear. In other words, they're barking, etc. That's because we haven't taught the dog to feel comfortable alone. We've just taught them to eat, and as soon as that food or distraction is gone, they're back to square one. So food puzzles are fabulous, but not as a quote fix for separation anxiety. Other things would be like leave a T-shirt that smells like you, or maybe use some all great ideas for a dog that just maybe is new to the home or feeling a little bit unsettled. I'm not saying that these are not good ideas, but when we have a dog that's suffering from separation anxiety, truly, then these are not going to get them to the resolution. So I would say, beyond the myths, step one would be suspend absences, and step two would be to find a qualified professional who, in my opinion, should be a certified separation anxiety trainer, because the protocols that we use are proven to work and very systematic and, of course, based in positive reinforcement. So that would be my suggestion.
How can people reach out to you then?
So my website is positiveanimalwellness.com, and there is a tab on the top that says separation anxiety, and they can just fill out that little brief form. And then, as I mentioned before, we would schedule a time to talk about what's going on and presumably how I could help if we did determine that separation anxiety was the issue.
That's great. So primarily your work is done online, so no matter where they are in the world, they'll be able to reach out to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I actually work about 80 to 90% on the time online, except if I'm traveling for presentations or occasionally traveling to clients. But with separation anxiety, we're teaching the dog to feel relaxed alone. So there's no scenario in which I need to be present. We're just teaching the person to slowly desensitize to all of the pre-departure cues and ultimately their departure, and then working on duration. So I've had clients all over the world that I've worked with. In fact, I'm going to be heading to India in 2 weeks to do presentation for some trainers, and also work with some keepers at an elephant sanctuary on some lower stress handling techniques. And I'll still work with my separation anxiety clients who are mattered all over the rest of the planet.
As a groomer, we often say that the number one tool that any pet parent should have if they have a dog with hair is a comb. So as a trainer, what would you say would be the number one tool for your clients to have if they have a dog that they're dealing with separation anxiety?
Well, this tool is key: patience and consistency for anyone working with any behavior modification. Patience would be my number one tool with working with separation anxiety, because certainly behavior modification is going to take some time in general, but there is absolutely no quick fix with separation anxiety. And oftentimes we're working in really, really small criteria. We might be talking about seconds, eventually seconds turning into minutes. We celebrate when we get to a minute. We celebrate when we get to 5 minutes. And there can be some social pressure too, because friends and family, although well-intentioned, might say again, just put the dog in a crate or leave him alone. He'll eventually get over it, or, get some medication, without realizing that separation anxiety is a very real issue that requires a specific protocol to help the dog over time. And again, I emphasize over time to put that expectation out there, to feel more comfortable alone. So patience is going to be a key component to the success of this protocol.
Something that a lot of people will deal with when having a dog with separation anxiety is people will say that it's an obedience issue. So do you suggest that they be doing hard obedience as well as their separation anxiety training or protocols? Or will the obedience kind of come along and the priority is to deal with the protocol for separation anxiety first and then work on the obedience after?
It depends on the case. Oftentimes we find if a dog is suffering from separation anxiety that perhaps there are some other behavioral issues at play as well. Usually I try to keep that separate. I'm happy to work with clients individually on other issues, but that goes sort of outside of the purview of this very specific separation anxiety protocol because it's so intense and because we essentially meet daily for a minimum of 4 weeks to begin with, and oftentimes it's much longer than that because, again, it's not a quick fix. Having said that, if there are some things, I had a client who, as we were starting to desensitize to their movements ultimately towards departure at the door, the dog was jumping up and nipping the whole time. So obviously they couldn't move around if the dog continued to do that. So we did address that with some marking and reinforcing of an alternative behavior like a sit or a forepaws on the floor. But in general, that would be, those types of behavioral issues would be separate. Many times we have dogs who are dog or people reactive, leash reactive, again, have some other behavioral issues. Sometimes we have clients who may have worked with aversive trainers in the past, which, as we know, can exacerbate anxiety. And I will speak to those points and certainly encourage someone. I haven't yet had a client who continued to work with an aversive trainer whilst we worked together, and I think I would strongly discourage that because it would be a little bit shoveling sand against the tide kind of thing. Not that that other behaviors being worked on via aversives would be the same as separation anxiety protocol, but I certainly feel like it could have an impact if we were continuing to exacerbate anxiety in general in other areas of the dog's life.
I'd mentioned that I do some work with our local rescue, Alberta Dachshund Rescue, and occasionally, we have to place a dog that we might consider having, that maybe we consider has separation anxiety. And of course, it's always a challenge to place that type of dog. Now, maybe could you share a story that's a success story that you have from working with a dog with a dachshund that had separation anxiety, so that people can see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I've worked with probably big dogs, small dogs, all kinds of different dogs, because it's not a breed-specific behavioral issue, as most aren't. And had a cute dog named MP who had another dog in the family, who was also suffering from separation anxiety. And, at the beginning, the mom could not leave for seconds. And by the end, it's quite possible that she could go out to lunch, to dinner, off in the car for a couple of hours. And I'll often share these types of stories with clients as we're working through the protocol too, because again, it can be kind of a lonely road where others may not quite understand. There was a client of mine who said she knew someone who had expressed excitement at reaching 15 minutes, and everybody looked at her like she was crazy. But again, we celebrate that. That's a big milestone. So certainly it's possible. Within rescue, it's a little bit different, because even if you work with a dog who's suffering from separation anxiety, let's say in a foster home, the work will still need to continue. And once the dog gets into a home of his own. So placing a dog with separation anxiety, I recognize, can be a challenge. Frequently, if we have people who already have a lot of that management in place, that can be really a good fit. Like someone who maybe works from home and then just needs a little bit of coverage versus, say, someone who's out of the house for 8 hours a day. But it's certainly, with patience and consistency, is possible to help dogs with separation anxiety to get to that point where they can feel comfortable alone and their humans can have their life back.
The more that we talk, it becomes really clear that really patience and the consistency is really what's going to make a real difference and a change in a dog with separation anxiety. Now, before we head on to the end of the interview, maybe is there anything that you'd like to add that maybe we haven't discussed?
Yeah, I think in terms of expectation, again, the amount of time that it's going to take and the fact that it's going to be really slow moving at the beginning, and coupled with that, working with a professional can really be a great benefit because, again, it can be very demoralizing when those around you just maybe don't get it, and or, you have to cancel, you can't go someplace because you don't have coverage for your dog, folks not understanding that. And even the movement at the beginning being in such small increments, it can be hard to continue to booster morale if you don't have sort of a cheering section on your side. So I think for all of those reasons, it can be really beneficial to work with a professional. Also, one last point on that is really determining how to break down the criteria. We in training will say we want to split criteria versus lumping it together. And someone who's read online, how to resolve separation anxiety might get things like pick up your keys, leave for 5 minutes, pick up your keys, leave for 10 minutes. 5 and 10 minutes might be way down the line. So again, we're talking about maybe stand up, sit back down. You haven't even moved. Yeah. That might be our starting point. So it can be helpful to work with someone who's done this before, who knows what you're going through, and who is a professional at working through this protocol.
Do you have some sort of connection between your clients, maybe a Facebook group or any kind of place where they can discuss what's going on in their cases?
The reason that hasn't come about is, and I know that some of them are out there, but we've seen, with Facebook groups, they can certainly be beneficial, but sometimes they can sort of take life on of their own, and people can offer anecdotal information as to what's worked for them, which may not be the same as what your trainer might suggest for you in this case. So we do want really for folks to understand it's an individualized protocol, and what, again, has worked for another family might not be the same road to success for you. So we don't have something like that at this time. But having said that, when I work with a client who has separation anxiety, a dog with separation anxiety, we are working closely on a daily basis. So they have a support system in place, at least in terms of me or another CSAT trainer that they would be working with, because, again, we work so closely and generally for a good period of time.
Well, that makes total sense. We know I know that you have a couple of books out there. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit about them in case anybody listening might be interested in reading one of those books and getting even more information from you?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. My first book, as I mentioned earlier, was A Deaf Dog Joins the Family, which I had written when we officially adopted Blanca. And that is available on Amazon and now in Kindle, and also through Dogwise, as well as the Karen Pryor Academy store. And yesterday, I actually was just doing an interview on positive pet advice because my co-authors and I, Jay Anders and Anne Francis, have written grooming, low-stress grooming book, which is, again, teaching people to take those additional steps when we're working with animals to help them feel comfortable with husbandry, handling, and the grooming process. So that book is called Grooming Without Stress. Safer, quicker, happier, setting the 21st century grooming table up for success by employing low-stress handling techniques. Again, the shorter version is Grooming Without Stress.
Yeah, that's a lot of a title.
There's always a subheading. But Grooming Without Stress is also available on Amazon and Karen Pryor Academy store. And then my latest book is Your 10-Minute-a-Day Dog, a training guide to using your time wisely to communicate effectively. And I wrote that book because oftentimes people, will say, I don't have time for training, or I'm going to do that when my dog turns 1, or without realizing that every single interaction is training. So I wanted a place where people could realize that just, using those 10 minutes, everybody spends at least 10 minutes a day on social media. And if you could carve out 10 minutes, it doesn't even have to be all at once, but a minute here, 30 seconds there, a minute here, 2 minutes there, that's going to really take you far if you're using that time wisely and effectively towards moving that behavior needle to behaviors that you want to see more of. And there are some plans, and there's a Facebook support group, which is paired with that book, Your 10-Minute-a-Day Dog. where people can share successes and ask questions. So that was a good question you had earlier, because there is one.
Now, is there maybe another book that you found inspirational that maybe someone who's considering becoming a trainer or working with dogs might be interested in reading?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. One other mention, I'm going to be at the Groom Expo in Hershey, Pennsylvania. So I'll be doing some chats on low stress handling there. Hope to see some other grooming friends there. And back to your most recent question, Karen Pryor wrote Don't Shoot the Dog many years ago, but it's still a very relevant book. And I think it's a good jumping off point for folks that might be interested in learning more about behavior and training. I am, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, a KPA faculty member. I have a KPA course in Texas that's registering now, as well as a world program here in Puerto Rico. And so if people are serious about taking that path, they can take a look online to see about possibly applying for the program. I'm also running a conference here in Puerto Rico in November with Dr. Susan Friedman and Laurie Stevens, which is animal training and behavioral wellness event. Includes lots of great information, goodie bags, and need I say more? It's in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
So still have some spots open to join us for lots of learning that weekend too.
If you could bring one of your dogs back across the Rainbow Bridge for just one day, which one would it be, and how would you spend your day?
Yeah, and I knew you were going to ask me this, but I still didn't have a really great answer because I would want to bring them all back. Of course, we've been so lucky to have several nice animals in our lives and in our family, and I think whenever possible, it's a good reminder to just really take the time to do fun things with them. Take a nice relaxing walk, where, again, for dogs, where they're getting lots of mental stimulation, sniffing, maybe go get a puppuccino. That's a new thing I discovered. Apparently in the States, people know that. But when we evacuated for the hurricane, we went through Starbucks and the dogs got a puppuccino, which is essentially whipped cream in a cup, but it was very exciting for everybody. So doing little things like that really, help you to make positive memories together, I think is a key you don't want to miss out on.
Thank you so much, Terrie, for sharing your time with us and sharing the books and your knowledge that you have with our Wiener Dog loving friends. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you so much. It was great to get together with you to talk about one of our favorite subjects this morning, animals.
Terrie really gave us a thorough explanation of what separation anxiety really is, and I really hope that if you are struggling with separation anxiety with your Dachshund, that you send her an email and hopefully the two of you can work together to get it straightened out. If you have a Wiener Dog story, an event, or a topic you'd like to see us cover, send an email, bark@wienerdoglover.com. Follow us on Instagram, wiener_dog_lover_, or Twitter @lovingwienerdog, or find us on Facebook, Wiener Dog Lover. Never miss an episode. Head on over to wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we put out a new podcast. I'd also be grateful if you would leave us a review. Until next time, Wiener Dog lovers, this is Lori, Sheba, and the Wieners signing off. If you have a Wiener Dog story, an event, or a topic you'd like to see us cover, send an email, bark@wienerdoglover.com. Follow us on Instagram, wiener_dog_lover_, or Twitter @lovingwienerdog, or find us on Facebook, Wiener Dog Lover. Never miss an episode. Head on over to wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we put out a new podcast. I'd also be grateful if you would leave us a review. Until next time, Wiener Dog lovers, this is Lori, Sheba, and the Wieners signing off.